The 10 forgotten plants that fed civilizations for 1,000 years. In 8,000 years of human agriculture, people figured out how to grow food in deserts, at 13,000 feet above sea level, through droughts that lasted decades and winters that buried crops under 4 feet of snow. They didn't have fertilizer, they didn't have GPS-guided tractors, they didn't have Monsanto. They had plants. Specific plants that worked so well, so reliably, that entire civilizations were built on them. Empires ran on them. Cities of 200,000 people were fed by them. Armies marched for months, sustained by nothing else. And then, in the space of about 200 years, almost all of them were gone. Not because they stopped working, they still work. Not because something better replaced them. The replacements are mostly worse, but because a conqueror burned the fields. And because a combine harvester couldn't navigate a wetland. Because a government handed out free pinto beans and told a people their traditional crop was primitive. One by one, the plants that fed civilization got erased. And what replaced them is a food system that runs on 3 crops: corn, wheat, and soy. All of them dependent on fossil fuel-derived fertilizer, all of them requiring industrial infrastructure, and all of them one bad growing season or one supply chain failure away from leaving your shelves empty. Every single plant on this list is still growable right now. Most of them are still available. Some of them are harder to find than they used to be, and a few of them, the ones at the top of this list, are almost gone. If that's the kind of information you think matters, hit subscribe now. Because this is the video that most channels won't make. Because there's no seed company paying them to promote these plants. There's no corporate sponsor. There's just 10,000 years of evidence that this stuff works, and the fact that most people have never heard of any of it. Let's go. Number 10, skirret. Henry VIII ate this. You can't find it in any grocery store. Henry VIII. The man had 6 wives and executed 2 of them. He had absolute power over one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. And when he sat down for dinner, one of the things on his plate was skirret. Not a potato, not a carrot, skirret. The root vegetable that dominated European royal tables for centuries and then vanished from the food supply so completely that most people alive today have never heard the word. Sium cicerum, skirret. And a perennial root crop that's been growing in European gardens since at least the 12th century. King Richard II had his royal cooks use it. It appears in the form of curry, the Royal Cookbook of 1390. Medieval Europeans grew it in monastery gardens, in royal estates, in peasant plots, not as a curiosity, as a staple. The root crop that kept people fed through European winters before anyone on this continent had seen a potato. Here's the nutritional reality. Skirret root is roughly 65% sugar by dry weight. That's not a flaw. That's a feature. In a world before refined sugar, before candy, before anything sweet was cheap or available, a root that tastes naturally sweet and grows as a perennial without replanting was extraordinary. You plant it once and it comes back for 10 years or more. While you divide the root clumps every few seasons, and you've multiplied your stock for free. You never buy seeds again. It grows in zones 3 through 9. That's almost the entire country. It tolerates partial shade, which most root crops won't. You can tuck it under the canopy of a food forest where nothing else produces. The plant reaches about 3 feet tall and produces clusters of roots the size of a finger. Boil them, roast them, eat them raw. They taste like a cross between a parsnip and sweet corn. Then the potato arrived in Europe in the 16th century. Within 200 years, skirret was commercially extinct. Not because it was inferior, it wasn't, but because the potato produced more volume per acre on good agricultural land, and once farmers optimized for yield, diversity was the first thing that died. Our 700 years of cultivation knowledge, 700 years of variety selection, of adapting this plant to different climates and conditions, erased in 2 centuries. Henry VIII ate this. You've never heard of it. Think about what else we've lost. Number 9, oca. Grows at altitudes where potatoes die. There's a region of the Andes where potatoes can't grow. Above 13,000 feet, the altitude is too high, the nights too cold, the soil too thin. It's where the air gets thin and the frost comes every month of the year, and the people who live there are not hungry, because for 8,000 years, they've been growing something else. Oca, Oxalis tuberosa, the second potato. Not because it resembles a potato, it doesn't much, but because it fills the same ecological role, the same nutritional role, the same cultural role in the places where the potato refuses to grow. 8,000 years of continuous cultivation. That's not a rounding error, that's longer than written history. The Inca grew oca as one of their primary crops. The Aymara grew it. The Quechua grew it. The people who engineered the terraced agricultural systems at Machu Picchu, who fed cities of hundreds of thousands at elevation, they grew oca, not as a supplement, as a staple. Here's what makes it nutritionally significant. Oca has twice the vitamin C of a standard potato, twice the iron. The oxalic acid content, which sounds alarming, is reduced simply by leaving the harvested tubers in the sun for a few days. Traditional practice going back thousands of years that most modern researchers didn't bother to understand before declaring the crop difficult. It has over 400 documented traditional varieties. 400. Most of them with different colors, different flavors, different growing characteristics suited to different microclimates across 8,000 years of adaptation. The Spanish came, they had potatoes. And slowly, systematically, the traditional polyculture of the Andes, Oque, Mashua, Uluco, dozens of other crops, got pushed aside in favor of crops that fit European agricultural systems and European tastes. 400 varieties of Oque, accumulated over 8,000 years. And now you can barely find it in North American seed catalogs. It grows in zones 7 through 10 in the ground year-round, and as in annual and colder zones where you can give it a long season. It wants cool temperatures during tuber formation, well-drained, moderately fertile soil. The plants are compact, the leaves are edible, and the tubers taste better than most potatoes, sweeter, more complex, with a slight tartness that cooks out completely into something rich and starchy. It's been feeding people at the edge of the world for 8 millennia. It can feed you too. Number 8, einkorn wheat. The original wheat, 20% more protein. Big agriculture replaced it with an inferior product. Utsi the Iceman was murdered somewhere in the Alps around 3,300 BC. They found his body in 1991, preserved in glacier ice for over 5,000 years. And when forensic scientists analyzed the contents of his stomach, they found einkorn wheat, not modern wheat. And not bread wheat, not the semi-dwarf, nitrogen-dependent, high-yield variety that covers 500 million acres of the planet today. Einkorn, the original. The wheat that humans first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent roughly 10,000 years ago. Einkorn, Triticum monococcum, has been feeding humans for 10,000 years. Modern wheat has been feeding humans for about 60. Here's what we traded away in that swap. Modern wheat averages 10 to 13% protein by weight. Einkorn reaches up to 21%. That's not a marginal difference. That's nearly double. And einkorn protein includes significantly higher concentrations of lutein, a carotenoid that protects against macular degeneration, and more fat-soluble vitamins than any modern wheat variety. Here's what actually killed einkorn: the Green Revolution of the 1960s. So agricultural scientists developed semi-dwarf wheat varieties that produce 5 times more grain per acre. 5 times. That's an extraordinary yield increase. But those varieties require something einkorn doesn't. Massive inputs of nitrogen fertilizer synthesized from natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. Einkorn grows in poor, rocky, marginal soil with zero fertilizer. It evolved to grow where nothing else will. The semi-dwarf varieties require fossil fuel inputs to produce. Do the math on what that means when the supply chain for petrochemical fertilizer gets disrupted. Einkorn grows in zones 5 through 9. Full sun, good drainage. It handles poor soil and drought in ways modern wheat simply cannot. The grain is smaller than modern wheat and requires a bit more processing, but it grinds into flour with a richer, nuttier flavor. Now the seed is available. The knowledge to grow it is available. What's not available is any industrial infrastructure for processing it at scale, because the entire grain system was retooled for semi-dwarf varieties in the 1960s, and nobody has looked back since. Wonotsi was eating the better wheat. We switched to the inferior product because it produced more volume per acre. Then we built the entire global food system around that inferior product's dependency on fossil fuels. That's not progress. That's an extremely fragile bet. Number 7, goosefoot. Fed North America for 6,000 years. Extinct within 100 years of contact. Before corn, there was something else. Most people think corn was always the crop of North America, that before European contact, this continent's agriculture was corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Right? And that's true, for some regions, for some periods. But in the Mississippi River Basin, in the river valleys of the Midwest, there was an agricultural civilization that was growing crops centuries before the corn complex arrived. And it was growing things that have almost completely vanished. The Eastern Agricultural Complex, a pre-corn agricultural system built on native North American plants, developed by the Mississippian cultures starting around 1900 BC, 3,900 years ago. These were sophisticated farmers growing an integrated polyculture of native crops. And the one that outperformed everything else, that formed the caloric backbone of this civilization for thousands of years, was a plant most people have never heard of. Chenopodium berlandieri, peat seed goosefoot. Goosefoot is a small seeded grain. Sure related to quinoa and lamb's quarters. The Mississippian farmers selected it for improved seed size over thousands of years of cultivation. They developed a domesticated subspecies specifically adapted to their agricultural system. And a 2019 study comparing polyculture yields of traditional Eastern complex crops found that these systems exceeded global averages for both quinoa and buckwheat. That's not ancient technology being romanticized. That's modern agricultural science confirming that people who were called primitive were outproducing what we consider high-performing specialty crops today. Here's what makes goosefoot remarkable from a nutritional standpoint. It has the highest protein density of any starchy seed in the North American archaeological record, higher than corn, higher than amaranth. When the seeds process easily and have a nutty, mild flavor. You cook them like quinoa, you grind them into flour, you sprout them for greens. The plant is closely related to lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album, which grows wild across North America right now as a weed in your garden. The leaves taste like spinach. You're pulling it up and throwing it away. It's food. The domesticated subspecies is now functionally extinct. The contact era epidemics killed the farmers who kept the seeds. The agricultural systems collapsed. The cultivated varieties, selected over thousands of years of intentional breeding, were gone before anyone thought to preserve them. A people with a food system that outproduced modern quinoa, erased in a generation. The wild relatives are still there, lamb's quarters is everywhere, but the crop is gone. That's what the loss of knowledge looks like when you don't write it down and the people who hold it die. Number 6, cattail. The most calorie-dense plant per acre on the planet, and nobody grows it. Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. 6,475 pounds. That's the flour equivalent that 1 acre of cattail produces per year. Not 6,475 pounds of biomass. Not 6,475 pounds of something you'd have to process into something edible. 6,475 pounds of starch-rich rhizome flour equivalent per acre, per year, without planting, without fertilizing, without irrigating, without doing anything at all. No cultivated grain crop on Earth comes close on a per-acre basis without fossil fuel inputs. Wheat averages around 2,000 pounds per acre. Rice, closer to 3,000. Those numbers require fertilizer, irrigation, pesticides, and replanting every single year. Cattail produces more from wetland that nobody else is farming, from a plant that nobody planted, that maintains itself and spreads aggressively, that has existed in every marsh, pond edge, and drainage ditch in North America for thousands of years. And almost nobody is harvesting it. Typha latifolia, cattail. The U.S. Army studied it during World War II, looking for calorie sources that could sustain soldiers in the field without supply chain support. They confirmed the calorie density. They confirmed the feasibility. And then the war ended and the research went into a file cabinet. Because you can't build an agricultural industry around a wetland plant that no combine harvester can process. So the knowledge got buried because it wasn't profitable to pursue. Here's the practical reality. Every single part of a cattail is edible. The roots are starch. You pull them up, pound them in water, let the starch settle, pour off the water, dry it. That's flour. The young shoots in spring taste like cucumber. The immature flower heads taste like corn on the cob. You boil them and eat them off the spike. The pollen in early summer falls in clouds off the male flowers. Shake it into a bag. It's a high-protein flour substitute. Mix it 50-50 with your cattail starch for a complete baking flour that requires zero agricultural infrastructure. Cattail grows in zones 2 through 11. That's essentially every temperate zone on the planet. It grows wherever there's water. Pond edges, stream banks, rain gardens, any low spot that stays wet. You transplant a rhizome section and within 2 seasons it's established. Within 5, it's a full stand. No pruning, no pest control, no fertilization. You harvest when you need food and leave the rest alone. Your great-grandparents knew what cattails were. Their great-grandparents ate them. We forgot. The plant didn't go anywhere. It's sitting in the ditch at the end of your street right now, producing 6,475 pounds of flour equivalent per acre per year, and everyone is driving past it on their way to buy bread made from wheat that requires natural gas to produce. Number 5, sunchoke. Outyields potatoes by 200%, and it's perennial. A study conducted in Oregon, published research, real measured data, found that sunchoke yields without irrigation reach 64,000 pounds per acre. Not a projection. Acre measured yield. The average potato yield in the United States is approximately 20,000 pounds per acre, with irrigation, with fertilizer, with pesticides, with annual replanting. Do the math. Sunchokes outproduce potatoes by 200%, without irrigation, without fertilizer, without replanting. From a plant that once established comes back every single year and spreads aggressively enough that most gardening websites list it as a plant to be careful about. In a survival context, aggressive self-spreading is not a warning. That's the entire point. Helianthus tuberosus, Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke. Native to eastern North America, cultivated by indigenous peoples for at least 3,000 years, introduced to Europe in the early 1600s, where it briefly became a major food crop before getting sidelined. Here's why it got sidelined. So the tubers are high in inulin, a carbohydrate that your small intestine can't digest. It passes to your large intestine where bacteria ferment it. The result is significant gas. A 17th century English farmer named John Goodyear wrote that sunchokes were more fit for swine than men. That stuck. The most calorie-dense, most productive, most zero-maintenance root crop in North America got sidelined because it caused gas. The fix is simple. Cook them long and slow. Roast at low temperature for 45 to 60 minutes. Boil and then cool. Ferment. All of these methods break down the inulin significantly. Traditional preparation methods, across every culture that actually relied on sunchokes, involved extended cooking. The problem wasn't the plant. It was European colonizers eating them boiled for 20 minutes and then blaming the food. Sunchokes grow in zones 3 through 9, full sun to partial shade, Clay soil, sandy soil, poor soil. They don't care. They grow 6 to 10 feet tall, produce bright yellow flowers that support pollinators, and store their tubers in the ground all winter. You don't harvest them all. You leave a third in the ground and they come back, every year. No replanting, no fertilizer, no irrigation in most climates. The ground is your storage. You dig when you need food. You leave the rest alone. Native American communities relied on sunchokes for 3,000 years. They understood how to prepare them. One bad review from one 17th century Englishman almost erased that knowledge from common use. That's not a failure of the plant. That's a failure of the people who decided a colonizer's first impression mattered more than 3,000 years of successful cultivation. Number 4, Tepary bean. The Tohono O'odham grew 1.5 million pounds a year. Then the government gave them pinto beans. The Sonoran Desert. One of the most brutal agricultural environments on Earth. Summer temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall averaging less than 12 inches per year. Soil so poor, most crops die in the ground before they germinate. And the Tohono O'odham people, the desert people, farmed it for centuries. Successfully, abundantly. By some historical estimates, their traditional farming system produced roughly 1.5 million pounds of beans per year at its peak, in a desert. That number is real. How? The Tepary bean, Phaseolus acutifolius. A bean so adapted to desert conditions that it germinates in soil too dry for any other bean variety. It survives 100-degree heat. It produces on 400 millimeters of rainfall annually. That's 15 inches. In flash flood-based farming systems called acre chin, where fields were situated to catch and hold rainwater runoff, Tepary beans produced yields that fed entire communities through the desert heat without a single irrigation system. The nutritional profile is extraordinary, up to 32% protein by dry weight, higher than pinto beans, higher than black beans, higher than almost any other common legume. The seeds are small and dense and store for years without deterioration. The plants fix nitrogen into the soil. They build the ground instead of depleting it. That's infrastructure, not gardening. 3 forces destroyed Tepary bean agriculture. Mechanization. Tepary bean pods shatter easily in mechanical harvesters, so industrial equipment can't process them. World War II. Labor redirected away from traditional farming. And then the U.S. government, through food assistance programs, began providing commodity foods to indigenous communities. White flour, canned goods, pinto beans, cheap, processed, and calorie-dense in the way that destroys metabolic health. The traditional food systems collapsed within a generation. The Tohono O'odham now have the highest rate of type 2 diabetes of any population in the world. Approximately 50% of adults. The national average is around 3.4%. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when you replace 10,000 years of adapted traditional food with commodity processed food in the space of one generation. And here's what's not coincidence either. Tepary bean revival programs have measurably reduced diabetes rates in communities that returned to traditional foods. Not theoretically, measurably. The food was the medicine and we took it away. Tepary beans grow in zones 7 through 11. Full sun. Very well-drained soil. Minimal water. The more you water them, the worse they perform. They're programmed for desert conditions. Plant after last frost. They mature in 60 to 80 days. Seeds are available from Native Seeds/Search, which still carries traditional varieties. A crop that fed a civilization in the most hostile agricultural environment in North America for thousands of years. We traded it for pinto beans and handed an entire people a diabetes epidemic. That's not agricultural progress. That's agricultural violence. Number 3, Mashua. The Inca soldier's crop yields 62,000 pounds per acre. This one requires you to pay attention, because this is not a polite story. The Inca Empire stretched from present-day Colombia to central Chile. over 1 million square miles, tens of millions of people. Administered through a system of agricultural production and redistribution that required enormous quantities of food moving across extreme altitudes and impossible terrain. Armies marched for months, storehouses had to be full, and the Inca developed specific crops for specific purposes. Mashua, Tropaeolum tuberosum, was one of them. The fourth most important Andean crop after potato, oca, and ulico. Still grown today by roughly 9 million people in the Andes. Research yields have measured up to 70 tons per hectare. Do the math on that. That's approximately 62,000 pounds per acre, under research conditions, on marginal Andean soil, without synthetic fertilizer. It is one of the highest yielding root crops ever documented anywhere on Earth. It grows at elevations where nothing else survives, above 12,000 feet. In frost-prone conditions, in poor soil, it has virtually no serious pest or disease problems because it produces natural insecticidal compounds from its leaves and stems. No spraying, no fertilizing. You plant it and walk away. 0 inputs. The tubers harvest in fall and store well in cool conditions. Now, here's the part that explains why you've never heard of it. And the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, the same emperor who built Machu Picchu and expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, made mashua a standard ration for soldiers during military campaigns. Not because it was the most calorie-dense option. There were calorie-denser choices. But because mashua contains isothiocyanates that measurably suppress testosterone. In documented human studies, consistent mashua consumption reduced testosterone levels by approximately 45%. Read that number again. Pachacuti was feeding his soldiers a crop he knew would chemically suppress their sex drive while they were deployed. A Spanish chronicler named Father Bernabe Cobo wrote in the 17th century that soldiers fed mashua on long campaigns would forget their wives and mistresses. That reputation, accurate, documented, pharmacologically explained by modern science, followed mashua out of military service and into cultural obscurity. A crop that yields 62,000 pounds per acre, requires 0 inputs, grows at altitudes that kill everything else, has been feeding millions of people for thousands of years. Abandoned because it got a reputation. That's not agriculture. That's a failure of priorities. Mashua grows in zones 8 through 10 in the ground, as an annual in colder areas. Cool temperatures, well-drained, slightly acidic soil. The tubers taste mildly peppery raw and sweeten significantly after frost. Frost-kissed mashua is a traditional delicacy in the Andes. The seeds are available from specialty Andean crop suppliers. 62,000 pounds per acre. 0 inputs. The only reason you don't know this plant exists is that a 500-year-old reputation killed it. Think about that. Number 2, American chestnut. 3.5 billion trees. Dead in 40 years. You need to understand the scale of what was lost. Before 1904, 1 out of every 4 hardwood trees in Appalachian forests was an American chestnut. 1 in 4. From Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio River Valley, the American chestnut dominated the forest canopy. Trees reaching 100 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter. Single mature trees producing up to 300 pounds of nuts per year. Not every decade, every year, reliably, for centuries. They called it the bread tree of Appalachia. Not as a metaphor, as a description. The chestnut was the primary caloric foundation of Appalachian food systems for over 3,200 years. Native American communities, then colonial settlers, then Appalachian mountain communities, all built their food security around the chestnut in ways that are almost incomprehensible from where we stand now. Chestnuts were eaten fresh, roasted, boiled, dried into flour, ground into meal, fed to hogs that were then eaten themselves. The tannin-rich wood built barns, cabins, fencing, furniture, and railroad ties that lasted for generations without rotting. The nuts were sold for cash income. Children paid for their schooling with chestnut money. Whole economies ran on a single tree that required nothing from anyone. Here's the math. 10 chestnut trees producing 300 pounds each gives you 3,000 pounds of nuts per year. 3,000 pounds at roughly 1,400 calories per pound. Chestnut is nutritionally closer to a carbohydrate than a fat-dense nut. Making it comparable to grain is 4.2 million calories. 4.2 million calories from 10 trees that you planted once and never touched again. That's not gardening. That's food infrastructure at a scale most people can't conceptualize. Then, in 1904, a nursery worker at the Bronx Zoo noticed something wrong with the chestnut trees on the grounds. A fungal pathogen, Cryphonectria parasitica, had arrived on imported Japanese chestnut nursery stock. It had no natural checks. The American chestnut had no resistance. The fungus spread through airborne spores, tree to tree, across the entire range. Within 10 years, it had reached every state in the chestnut's territory. Within 40 years, 3.5 billion trees were dead. 3.5 billion trees in 40 years? The largest ecological catastrophe in North American history, where communities lost their primary food source in one generation. The Appalachian economy collapsed in regions that had been chestnut dependent for centuries. Wildlife populations that depended on chestnut mast, bears, deer, turkeys, crashed. The forest canopy changed permanently. An entire food system, functioning reliably for over 3,000 years, gone because someone imported nursery stock from Japan without thinking about what they were carrying. Here's where you pay attention. The American Chestnut Foundation has spent decades crossing blight-resistant Chinese chestnuts with American chestnuts, then back-crossing repeatedly to recover American characteristics while retaining the blight resistance gene. The result is a hybrid that looks, grows, and produces like an American chestnut but carries the resistance. Where these trees are available now, you can plant them. Chestnuts grow in zones 4 through 8, full sun, well-drained, slightly acidic soil. Plant 2 or more for cross-pollination. Expect first nuts in 3 to 7 years from grafted stock. And understand that when you plant one, you're not just growing a tree. You're undoing something. You're putting back into the landscape what a single careless nursery shipment took out of it 120 years ago. 3.5 billion trees. Gone in 40 years. The correction is available right now. Plant it. Number 1. Grain amaranth. The crop Cortez burned under penalty of death. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived in the Aztec Empire and found something that made him more uncomfortable than the warriors, more uncomfortable than the gold, more uncomfortable than anything else he'd encountered. A crop. A single grain crop so productive, so nutritionally complete, so woven into every layer of Aztec civilization that the empire could not function without it. And he understood something that conquerors understand instinctively. Control the food, and you control the people. The Aztecs had been cultivating grain amaranth for 8,000 years. At the empire's peak, the provinces sent 20,000 tons of amaranth grain to the capital annually. 20,000 tons as tribute, as tax payment, as the material currency of the most powerful civilization in the Western Hemisphere. Armies ate it. Cities were fed by it. Priests mixed it with honey and blood to form edible statues of gods consumed during religious ceremonies. Amaranth wasn't just food. It was food, economy, religion, and civilization simultaneously. In 1519, Cortés made it a crime to grow amaranth. That's not a rumor. That's documented history. Fields were burned, seed stores were destroyed. Anyone caught cultivating or possessing amaranth faced punishment up to and including the amputation of their hands. The goal was explicit: destroy the food, destroy the religion, destroy the civilization. Break the nutritional and spiritual backbone simultaneously. Within one generation, amaranth cultivation collapsed across Central America. A crop that had fed 20 million people for 8,000 years was functionally eliminated in decades. Here's what Cortés tried to erase. Amaranth grain is 14% protein by weight, and it's a complete protein, all 9 essential amino acids, including lysine. That last detail matters more than most people realize. Lysine is the limiting amino acid in almost every major grain crop. Corn has virtually none. Wheat is low, rice is low. That means populations dependent on grain for protein are almost always lysine deficient, which manifests as stunted growth, immune suppression, and cognitive impairment. The Aztecs weren't just eating a grain. They were eating the one grain that covered the amino acid gap that every other grain on Earth leaves wide open. A single amaranth plant produces up to a quarter pound of grain. In a densely planted 10 by 10 foot bed, you're looking at 5 to 10 pounds of grain per season. The leaves are edible too, harvestable within 30 days of planting, with more iron than spinach and more calcium than kale. The plant grows in every climate zone, zones 2 through 11. It tolerates drought, heat, poor soil, and neglect. It matures in 90 to 120 days. It self-sows aggressively. Let a few seed heads fall and it comes back without replanting year after year. It stores for years in a cool, dry place. You cook it like rice, pop it like popcorn, grind it into flour, sprout it for fresh greens in 48 hours. A complete protein grain. Grows in any climate. Requires almost no water. Produces edible greens and seeds from the same plant. Self-sows. Stores indefinitely. Outproduces corn on poor soil with zero fertilizer. The Spanish Empire burned fields and cut off hands to keep people from growing this. Ask yourself why. The answer is the same as it always is. A population that can feed itself completely from a single crop they can grow for free in any soil is a population that doesn't need a conqueror. Self-sufficient people are ungovernable people. And so the first thing every conqueror does is destroy the food. Amaranth survived. It never disappeared completely. Scattered communities in Mexico and Guatemala maintained it quietly through 500 years of suppression. It made it to the seed banks. It made it back into commercial seed catalogs. You can buy amaranth seeds right now for a few dollars and have them in the ground this spring. That's what 500 years of suppression looks like when the plant wins anyway. 10 plants. Every single one of them fed a civilization. Several fed multiple civilizations for thousands of years without industrial infrastructure, without fossil fuel inputs, without supply chains stretching across 3 continents. Skirret on Henry VIII's royal table, a perennial root that came back for a decade without replanting. Oca at 13,000 feet where potatoes refuse to grow, in 400 varieties accumulated over 8,000 years of Andean cultivation. Einkorn in Ötzi's stomach 5,000 years before the Green Revolution replaced it with a fossil fuel-dependent substitute that produces more volume but requires a supply chain to survive. Goosefoot in the Mississippian agricultural complex, outperforming modern quinoa in polyculture, yields before European contact wiped the farmers and the seeds out simultaneously. Cattail producing 6,475 pounds of flour equivalent per acre per year in the ditch, at the end of your street while you drive past it to buy bread. Sunchokes out-yielding potatoes 200% without irrigation or inputs. Sidelined for 400 years by one bad review from one 17th century Englishman. Tepary beans feeding a desert civilization that produced 1.5 million pounds of protein per year until the government replaced them with commodity pinto beans and gave a people the highest diabetes rate on Earth. Mashua yielding 62,000 pounds per acre at altitude, abandoned because an emperor used it to manage his army's hormones. The American chestnut building the caloric and economic foundation of Appalachian life for 3,200 years until one infected nursery shipment from Japan killed 3.5 billion trees in 40 years. And amaranth, the complete protein grain that fed 20 million people through 8,000 years of cultivation and survived 500 years of active suppression because it grows in any soil, in any climate, and feeds itself. You don't need to grow all of them. Start with 2, the ones that fit your climate, your zone, your situation. But start, because every year you don't have these plants established is a year you're 100% dependent on a food system that has proven repeatedly and historically that it breaks. Not that it might break, that it breaks. The American chestnut broke in 40 years. The Mississippian agricultural complex broke in a generation. The Andean polyculture system broke when the Spanish arrived. And the modern 3-crop industrial food system is one supply chain disruption, one fertilizer shortage, one bad growing season away from breaking right now. The plants that fed 1,000 years are still here. Most of them are still available. Some of them are barely hanging on. The seed companies that carry traditional varieties are small operations. The stocks are limited. And the window to learn these crops, to establish them, to build the knowledge into your hands and your soil before you need it, that window is open right now. Start this weekend, not next month, not next spring, this weekend. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.